Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 17th chapter in the book of Matthew. Herein we read of the story and event known as the Transfiguration, common throughout all the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, yet the word transfigured appears nowhere in either one of them. Nevertheless, that has become the traditional term to describe the effect of the scene. It's a really, really unique one, we'll just say that. But they all take place in the same linear projection, so they're preceded by a scene, and each author offers their own space of time of days. We'll get into that when we actually read the verse itself. But what we want to do first is just briefly review what we read in the second half of the most recent chapter. And once more, this pattern is reflected, and what comes after it, the healing of a blind man, is reflected throughout all three. So this takes place in sequence. This is so in the 13th verse, they're in Caesarea Philippi. That was a city of Roman and pagan and I think it was the original site of the emperor worship cult. But he asked the pertinent question, who do men say that the Son of Man is? Then they recite the variety of gossip with little truth, just speculation and gossip and rumor. Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets, John the Baptist, all them. And then he turns it personal. His question takes a personal turn back to them. He said to them, "And you, who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answering said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim." Now the answer to that, the answer to that answer is a revelation of his full divinity. So he had come at the correct confession at this point, and he had finally realized who he was walking with, and he gives him full frontal access. Him and the trio of intimate disciples, we'll name them when we name them. Just this confirmation that he was who Peter said he was, and he says that flesh and blood, this is not human reason did not tell you this. This was revealed to you by my Father. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. And he promises him to be the rock on whom his church will be founded. There's a whole host of extreme interpretations to that by the Catholic Church. We won't even get into it. But the forces of hell shall not overcome it. The real church, the authentic church, perhaps not them, or at least not in the whole. Then he tells his disciples that they should say no more that he is Yahshua Messiah. For that time, Yahshua began to show his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and to suffer much from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and to be raised again the third day. So this was all necessary. These are logically prior steps in the ladder to his splendor and esteem, which is by connection our splendor and esteem. So it was arranged by providence that in order to procure our atonement and secure our salvation, it was necessary. That means from the divine plan that he suffer and be killed. So it was, and this was all leading up to the resurrection. Naturally, the disciples gravitate around the suffering and the kill part. Peter just, literally seconds about coming across the, there's no length of duration indicated in the text itself, but he gives a wrong counsel, and Yahshua says the same thing he says to Satan in chapter 4, verse 10, "Get thee behind me." So he who had come to the correct confession of identity was now identified with having the spirit of Satan. Satan offered him the shortcut. There are no shortcuts to salvation. He refused at the temptation, and he took it all the way up to the cross. So that was all providentially arranged. And then he lays down he calls them a stumbling block. Your thoughts are not those of Elohim, that is me. Elohim is a team, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. They're a trio and a tandem. But those of men. So in other words, he has it completely wrong, because man cannot fathom, even conceive of divinity unaided. Then he lays down the three steps for discipleship. If anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So that's actually going to influence something we're going to read in the chapter, in the lesson itself, so hold that there. And then he says, verse 27, "For the Son of Man is going to come in the esteem of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward each according to his works." So what he's giving them by connection of this scene later in the week, towards the end of that week, he is saying that my splendor will be revealed, and this is going to be a portent and a precedent for the judgment to come and the second coming. And when that moment arrives, justice will be administered throughout the cosmos. We will each be rewarded. That does not necessarily guarantee us to a positive. That term is neutral. The term reward, we think of it in the positive, but it's more understood better in the neutral. So according to their works, that's the determining factor to which you're either rewarded or cursed. Now for the actual lesson itself, in the opening verse of the 6th chapter, "And after 6 days Joshua took Peter and James and John his brother, and brought them up on a high mountain by themselves." So the length of time between this, the preceding scene, is identified as 6 days, and after, that word is significant. I think Mark says the same thing, but in Luke he says about 8 days. So he had counted the night that they were in. That was the way that the ancient Jews counted times, was, so for instance, the 3 days, the death, the burial, and the resurrection, was not necessarily a 72-hour period, but it was part of one day. The Jews were in the habit of counting one day as a day. I hope that makes sense, but even if it didn't, I have to move on. Peter, Jacob, John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, these are the trio, the intimate companions, the disciples of the disciples, the ones with the most privileged and intimate access. And this is the trio, the tandem that emerges at Gethsemane, before he prays, he isolates himself from the 12 to the 3, and then to himself and his heavenly Father. And in that moment, they fall asleep. So these were men's, but the high mountain by themselves. So this was separate from the disciples once more. And the mountain is traditionally attributed or associated with the Mount Transfiguration is traditionally associated with Mount Hermon, but we feel that Mount Tabor, with Mount Tabor, but Mount Hermon, we endorse that simply because it's closer to Caesarea Philippi. Mount Tabor is, not, it wouldn't be that, unless they were traveling all day and every night, they couldn't cover that distance. So, there was interludes in between the 6 days of the previous scene and the last, but this is actually closer. The Mount Hermon is closer to Caesarea Philippi, so they have that distance, and it's also taller. Mount Tabor is some 1,800 feet at peak, whereas Mount Hermon is 9,000. So that just gives us a frame of the exact location of this event. But, I wasn't there, so I don't know. I'm just endorsing one. Scott, we encourage you to search not only the scriptures, but your own mind and heart as to what these things are. Verse 2, "And he was transformed before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as the light." So transformed, I earlier mentioned that the word transformation, transfiguration. So transformed, the Greek original here, transfigured, appears nowhere in the text. It's in any of these texts, but we do read transformed, and from the Greek original, that is a metamorphosis. So this is likened to a cocoon emerging as a big, beautiful butterfly. That is how increased, he came in the full, he was the revelation of Yahweh to man. And because, but his full splendor was hidden. This was a consequence of the incarnation. He had to surrender not only the fullness of his divine attributes. He wasn't omnipresent, for example, or omnipotent. He got tired, he got hungry, he got thirsty, but he. He was the radiance, as we read in Hebrews 1, chapter 3, and his white is being transformed to white as the light. So white in in the color symbolism connects to divinity and purity and wholeness. And see, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with them. So these are two quintessential figures of the Jewish people in the Old Testament. These are the all-stars, the absolute greatest of the greatest. There is Moses, who is the lawgiver, and then there is the Elijah, representative of the prophets. The laws and the prophets were respectively represented by them, the most prominent figures of their order. And they are talking, so this is not a trinity of men. It's not, Messiah is connected with them. He is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, as we read in Matthew 5:17. So that is why he's there, and they are resurrected beings. So they are already resurrected. If they appeared to him and they were conversing with him, just like I kind of am with you right now. And Peter answered, said to Joshua, Master, it is good for us to be here. If you want, let us make 3 booths, one for you, for Moses, and one for Elijah. That's just Peter being Peter. He's blurting out impulsively, and he's the spokesman of the group, so he doesn't know quite what to say. All that it is good for us to be here. He's seeing the full revelation and manifestation of his esteem and in splendor and just radiance, and he sees who he's surrounded with, the great figures of the law and the prophets, and he's saying, oh, no, I'm going to make them 3 booths, but this was temporary. This was a rare glimpse into what awaited them at the second coming. They were beholding the rider in the white horse as he would emerge in the second coming. While he was still speaking, see, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and see, a voice came out of that cloud, saying, This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. So we've heard this before. This is the same words from the same voice that came out of the baptismal waters in the 3rd chapter, and he's saying the same thing. This is my Son. He is identifying him to everyone in earshot. The beloved, he is the unique, only begotten. He loves all of us, but he is truly the beloved of Yahweh, and he is a source of delight, and he gives him satisfaction because he performs his will, and he's telling him to hear him, listen to him. What he's going to say is something, so he's almost the voice that leads up to the voice. He is the messenger to the message. And when the disciples heard, they fell on their faces and were much afraid. So this isn't a comforting sight to behold for the disciples. They are literally surrounded by divine splendor, which man is not physically or constitutionally capable of withstanding, and they're afraid, and they hear this voice that is the Almighty talking to him. Now, they had kind of knew the man they followed as a human before they came to know of him as God. So they were afraid, and so would we be if our shoes reversed. They didn't know what they were signing up for. They didn't know what they gotten into, but the first initial impression was we like what we see. Now they're reduced to fear. But Joshua came near and touched them and said, Rise and do not be afraid. So the same man who stills the waters for them on their behalf calms the storm in their spirit right now. He's telling them that all is settled. It is a momentary phenomenon, but it's over now, and there's no reason to be afraid. And having lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Joshua only. So before they had these halos, these ghosts or phantoms, it might seem, of Elijah and Moses, and we interpret this literally, that they were resurrected beings in the sight of the first fruit of the resurrection. But for any case, they're gone. The one whose voice had told them to listen to him was gone. His Son, the beloved and the only begotten and the esteemed. And they were coming down from the mountain. Joshua commanded them, saying, "Do not mention the vision to anyone until the Son of Man is raised from the dead." So he's imposing a moratorium and a silence on their speaking of this event, because whenever he imposes, sometimes when he heals, when he performs a miracle, he tells no one to tell them, and sometimes he tells them to go in the neighborhood, shout the message, but here he's imposing the restriction, do not mention this vision to anyone. So they were privileged beholders of this rare sight, this unique manifestation and revelation of the divinity of the man whom they had followed, thus confirming the accuracy of Peter's confession of who he was that we read of earlier. And the disciples asked him, saying, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah has to come first?" So the scribes would have been the doctors, or the legal scholars and the scriptural interpreters, the authorized or recognized ones, and they would have been familiar with Malachi 4:5, which says that Elijah will come and he will return the love of the fathers to their people. You can read it in that chapter, but Elijah, who we earlier mentioned, who they already had seen in the vision, comes back conceptually at least. The Elijah is, as the answer will soon be revealed, spoiler alert, it is John the Baptist. So the promises of Malachi are fulfilled in another, and there's that 400-year gap in between Malachi and John the Baptist that is just blank, at least from the scriptural standpoint. There was intertestamental writings, and some of them are preserved in what is known as the Deuterocanonicals, but none that we Protestants recognize as canonical. Moving on. And Joshua answered, said to them, "Elijah is indeed coming first, and shall restore all." So who is the one who paved the path and made the road and announced the herald? Who is the herald of the king to the kingdom? The kingdom is near. And then Joshua comes on the scene and says the kingdom has come. So John the Baptist plays that role. He is the announcement to the announcer, much as we saw the Heavenly Father in the same thing heard him during the Transfiguration. He's saying, "Listen to him. My voice is done here." It's obviously a terrifying presence, and one I wouldn't resort to unless completely necessary. There's no reason to be feared, but the disciples are fearful nevertheless through their own fault, because he is not constitutionally capable of being wrong. "But I say to you that Elijah has already come, and that they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wanted. In this way the Son of Man is also to suffer by them." So here the connections between Elijah and John the Baptist really increase. So this figure, Elijah, figures prominently in verses 1 through 13, the range we're going to be covering. And they had the promise, they had the writings, the scribes all knew that Elijah would come, and he's telling him that he already came. The past tense, they did not recognize him, but they did whatever he wanted. So the they in there is Herodias and Herod, one of the sons of Herod the Great, who married his brother's wife, and this sin John the Baptist boldly denounced. And the wife just wanted him gone. She wanted her head cut off, and that's exactly what she got eventually. But Herod had some mysterious portent or sense or spirit that there was truth to what this man was saying, and yet he was a creature of his wife, much like Ahab was a creature of Jezebel, and that's whom Elijah had to contend with. And he had to go on the run and be in the desert, and go every single second of his life was an emergency situation. He did escape death. He's one of the two figures to enjoy that distinction. We can read of that in 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter. I think I did one on that, rather recently, and not so long ago. And they did what they wanted with him. We read of this in Mark and all the other synoptics, or most fully in Mark, that she sent her daughter to Salome to seduce her stepfather, who he offered up even the half of the kingdom, and she was being a pawn of her mother. Her mother wished for her head on the platter, and that's what her daughter gave for dancing erotically in his presence to his delight and satisfaction, sufficiently enough for him to offer her up the half the kingdom. So even though John the Baptist was called to be a martyr, Elijah escaped that, but he was returned in him. But then the disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. So they make the connection I already alluded to, and I said spoiler alert, and maybe I shouldn't have done it, but I kind of like the way this is turning out. So the disciples, they weren't scribes. They had no professional training in Scripture, but they were literate Jews, as pretty much all of them were. The ancient Jews were distinct in universally educating their children, if not institutionally, but they were certainly all literate. But they draw the connection in their head that Elijah has already come. The promises and the prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled, and that's one of the four things that is revealed in this revelation. The number one is that he is a revelation of the splendor of his person. This is a unique manifestation. We don't read of it anywhere else. And we also read of the splendor of his kingdom, combined by Moses and Elijah, respectively, representative of the law and the prophets. So he is the fulfillment, as we've already read in Matthew 5:17, of the Old Testament, the law and the prophets. He is fulfilled in them. And there is also the splendor of his cross revealed. Now, suffering leads to splendor, and in between and in the midst, after he heals the demon possession boy, I think maybe not. He tells them again that he has to die and suffer. So he gave them this break, this blissful interlude of what was, because they were en route to Jerusalem. He was on his march to death, and they sadly missed it. But it's also a revelation of the splendor of his submission. So Peter taught that he thought that the Messiah, it was alien and repugnant to his mind at this moment in time, that the Messiah must suffer as he did and be ultimately publicly humiliated to the extent that he was. But he finally made sense of it with hindsight. So this is the path of discipleship and the price thereof. We have to deny ourselves. Self-denial reorients. That's proof that we are born again, that we are no longer self-centered creatures, but inclined towards others and helping others and uplifting others and elevating others. And then there comes the take your cross. So if there's a cross in his life, and he had to suffer before his splendor could be revealed, we have no right or reasonable expectation for we who call ourselves his disciples to not expect the same thing in our life. It might not be a literal cross, but there's a cross in all your lives, and that's part of the path of following him. So I hope that's the reason you're here. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.